adapted to that dangerous, stressful world that we saw up here, you know, the child who has adapted to that, you know, they may not be able to share or cooperate or use words at first choice. And so it gets tough because we expect kids to come to school and we expect them all to just do those things, right? Be able to self-regulate, be able to communicate with their peers and their adults. And that is going to be more difficult for these kids that come from that dangerous world. So the child will have to be actively taught the skills required to succeed in this content. And so I think of things like Second Step as a curriculum, you know, the pre-K through 8th grade curriculum that teaches empathy, and the cornerstone is empathy, but it also teaches self-regulation skills. And so, like I said, if these kids are coming into school and they grew up in that top world, that dangerous world, they're not coming into school with those skills. And so they need to be taught those skills. And that's why I see those curriculums as so vitally important. I think more and more and more we're seeing kids that can't self-regulate. They don't know how to manage their emotions. They don't know how to communicate. And even when, you know, when we talked a lot about life skills, you know, things in there where we're teaching them how to be assertive. So yes, you need to be able to tell people what you need, but you need to be able to do it in a respectful way. Or we're teaching them coping skills, deep breathing exercises, meditation, stress management, all those sort of things.
The way I like to think about it is when you have a child or an adult that you're interacting with even, and that adaptations versus expectations, they may not react the way you want them to react. And it's simply because they don't have the tools that you want them to have. They don't have those. They never were given those tools. And so we have to teach them. We have to give them those tools so that they're able to begin to meet some of those expectations a little bit more.
Keep it going, Megan. Love it. Thank you. All right, so cause and effect. Why would the age of a person at the time of maltreatment have a powerful effect, do you think? Why would the age of a person at the time of maltreatment have a powerful effect? So why does it matter that it happened to them at 2 versus happening to them at 20?
Does it have something to do with the brain development and, you know, how many connections?
Linda, I can't hear you. Can you say it again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Does it have to do with simple brain development? You know,
yeah.
How many connections the kids are making at the time of their life?
Right.
And the more the brain's developed, like 20, you know, the brain is a lot more developed than when it's, you know, 13.
Exactly. Yep. So the brain develops in a sequential pattern, right? So when you think about a baby, what does a baby really need? I mean, they don't need, when we're born, we don't need to know how to be able to do math equations, right? We just need to be able to breathe, eat, have human connection, sleep, right? And so we need nurture and protection in that period. So the parts of the brain that control internal body function and ability to connect to a primary care developer is earliest, because we need to depend on others. So that's when those relationships are really being formed. So I know they talk about, and there's so much data about this, but I know they've said by 3 years of age, about 80% of our brain is developed. By 6 or 7, you know, we really, and I think about it, like my mom died when I was 7, and I think, but you know what? I've heard so often that a lot of what is instilled in us and the person we're going to be has really been developed by 7. So those younger years, because our brains are so, you know, it's wired to depend on others to take care of us. That's when those really critical years of building those relationships. As the brain develops, there are sensitive periods for each brain region when the size and functional abilities of the region are most affected by experiences and most vulnerable to toxic stress. So there's different, yes, in those younger years, it's very important, when we're talking at birth or those elementary years, but definitely as we move into those upper elementary and teen years, they can be impacted as well. So toxic stress in early childhood has profound effects on brain structure and function that develop later in childhood. These functions include the emotional responses, social interaction, and abstract thinking. And that's why people say that early childhood is so very important when we're looking at ACEs, and it's true, it very is important. But brain research has been introduced, has been simplified and limited in scope. Each brain region has sensitive periods when it experiences powerful effects on our brain mass and functioning. So, for example, in those middle childhood years, ages 7 to 13, emotional and a verbal abuse can affect the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues. And that can be different between boys and girls. By the time we reach our mid-20s, we know our prefrontal cortex isn't completely developed till our mid-20s. Our central nervous system, with the brain as its common center, it orchestrates everything from our automatic body functions like breathing and heartbeat to complex goal-oriented behavior and abstract thinking. So it's just important to know that, yes, it's very, because our brains are developing at different rates, obviously in those elementary years, we know in those teen years very much so, that ACEs or that toxic stress can be very damaging for a young person. But there's hope at the end here. It sounds doom and gloom, but we'll talk about resiliency, where there's some people that can have very high ACE scores and still do very, very well because of protective factors or resiliency. So childhood times are also windows of opportunity for building resiliency, since the brain is developing during this period of time. So paying attention to sensitive development periods, we can do a better job protecting children and providing the kinds of challenges and supports that early periods of toxic stress and promote life, health, and well-being. So this is a time where I feel like in the prevention world that we can really be, yes, this is where they're going to be greatly impacted, but if we know very early on, maybe we don't know a child's ACE score, but we know a couple of things that have happened to them. Kids are very, very resilient, so there's things that we can be doing to not erase that ACE score or get rid of it, but help them become resilient despite that ACE score. Because we assume that a person's behaviors are a rebellious choice. And I think about that, when kids come in and they're not acting how we think we are, we think they're being, oppositional, defiant, or rebellious. And I always say, if you would be able to step back, we've all worked with people that have been, or children that have been very hard to work with. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but if we can step back and come from an empathetic side and say, I wonder what that person has been through. Or if we could only know their backstory, it could help us understand a little bit about why they are the way they are, and hopefully work with them to help them, give them the tools they need to cope with that stress. And I try to do that even with adults that I work with that I feel like might be really difficult to work with. Taking a step back and just going, I don't know their backstory, and that, if I could go through that story and kind of peel back the layers, I'm sure there's some things that have caused them to be where they're at today, right?
That's
this is
something.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say that's something that in many of our professions, it's really important for us to remember that. One of the things that when I worked for child protection, I always wanted to make sure that when we're working with the parents, we remember that toolbox that they likely love their kids very, very much, but they were not given, in most cases, the tools to be able to safely raise their children. And part of what my job as a worker was to try and help them build those skills so that they could be a safe caregiver for their children.
Absolutely.
And I think that goes to say with with a lot of jobs, law enforcement, having this information is really important to help you make those decisions when you're interacting with individuals who blow their top.
Yeah.
So.
Yep, absolutely it does. And again, it's not like you just, it's not an excuse for their behavior. It explains, though, where that comes from, you know, and it helps us have a little bit of empathy and understand how we might need to work with that person in a different way.
Exactly.
Yep, absolutely. This slide you guys don't have, but I will definitely get it to you. I thought it was a great example. So there was a principal that worked at an alternative school, and he decided to create this chart. So if there was a situation where a student needed to experience a disciplinary action, they would show this chart both to the person who they needed to talk to and the teacher or principal, whoever was going to work with that student. And if they were both in the green and ready to talk, they would talk about it then and address it then. If they're in the yellow, they would wait about an hour. And then wait a day, so maybe several hours or even the next day, until they were both ready to come together and talk about this situation in a calm manner. And after adopting this, it was a Lincoln High School. I don't think it was Lincoln Sioux Falls because it was an alternative school, but they saw suspension dropped by 85%. Suspension, out of school suspension. So this made students likely to graduate and less likely to enter the criminal justice system. So it was just a simple, really a simple act that the principal recognized that not all students, because if they grew up in that dangerous world that we saw, that is going to be their action. Like Megan said, it can blow their top, or maybe act a little bit more aggressively. And so to address it in that situation wasn't going to be good for anybody involved. And knowing that, you know what, we do need to talk about it. It's not saying they aren't going to experience a disciplinary action, but we're going to do it when we're both ready and we're in a calm manner. And I thought that was a really good example. You know, of someone doing something pretty simple, but making a really big impact and seeing the need for that. Questions or comments about that?
I pulled out this sheet that I'd like to do with everyone, if you're okay with it, Michelle.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I'll if you don't have it, I'll make sure that you get it so it can get sent to everyone as well. So this is called Brain in the Palm of the Hand, and I always mess it up, so I'm going to read it word for word. But it's called Concepts. It's from Concepts from Parenting from the Inside Out by Daniel Seigel and Mary Hartzell. So I want everybody to put up their hand. All right. Pretend that your hand is a brain. Imagine that the palm of the hand to the wrist is the part of the brain called the primitive brain, or your reptilian brain. The primitive brain controls the body's automatic functions. These are the bodily functions that happen automatically, like heartbeat and breathing. Now, cross your thumb over the palm to represent the midbrain. This part of the brain controls our fight or flight response to a danger or threat. When faced with danger, we can either stay and fight or run away. This part of the brain also stores our old memories. Those memories can make us feel scared or angry or sad or more. And sometimes we don't know what those memories are. Like what she said earlier, they're stored in the body. We may not realize that those are memories that we're reacting to. Now, cover the thumb with the fingers. This represents the cortex. The cortex is where self-control and self-regulation happen. Self-control is when you look before you leap. The front, where your fingernails are, is the only place where thinking, positive social behavior, and problem solving happen. What happens when you get upset? That's right, you flip your lid. What happens when we flip our lid? Our fight or flight response is exposed and active. Our thinking, analyzing, and problem skills go offline, and our old memories and related feelings are exposed and triggered. When lids are flipped, this is not the time to problem solve. Will these two people help the situation right now, yelling at each other? You can't see the picture. No. Will they be able to work together to find a solution while they're upset and angry? No. So everybody needs a chance to calm down and let their brains close their lid and think clearly again. And that's when they'll be in that green, ready to talk.
Thank you. That's cool. Good visual. It's a good one for kids too. Just a good visual. Any questions or comments so far? All right, we're going to now dive in a little bit more into the ACE study itself. This is another slide that you guys do not have, but I'll get it to because it wasn't part of the core slides. But when Anda and Felipe were deciding to do this ACE study test, you know, we already knew that risk factors could impact the social, emotional, and cognitive functioning of a person, the health risk and behaviors, the disease and disability, and early death. But what we started to, they felt like there was something missing to this pyramid. The top three layers were known, I should say, the health risk behaviors, the disease, and the early death, but they felt like there was something missing, and that's why they decided to do this ACE study. They could see that these risks were not random, but they are connected in some populations and not in others. And that's when they started to look at how ACEs, or the adverse childhood experiences, were maybe impacting some of this, and that historical trauma. They've even added that historical trauma as well. So the ACE study is unique because it provides the potential to understand how multiple forms of childhood stress could affect many important public health problems. So again, the ACE study it began in 1991. And in 1994, the CDC provided funding to conduct the ACE study at the Department of Prevention Medicine in San Diego. This Kaiser study, it was 17,000 people. A majority of people, I would say, were middle-class Caucasian people. The ages ranged from 19 to 94. Most of them were well-educated. Most had attended college, and only 6% did not have a high school diploma, compared to the 13% of the US population that does not have a high school diploma. And, you know, like I said, they were predominantly white middle-class people who had access to the best healthcare in the world. So why am I pointing that out? Well, it's important to realize that these people had a lot of protective factors. They had great healthcare. They were middle class, they were educated, and this is what they found from the study. Oh, you know what, before that, we're gonna watch a video. So Nadine Burke-Harris, you've maybe seen her lately. If you've seen anything with ACEs, you've probably seen a lot about her. She's a pediatrician who once discovered ACEs. It really changed her whole way of her medical practice and how she addressed health issues with the children she was working with. And so this is a TED Talk that she did. It's about 16 minutes long, How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across the Lifespan. Let's see. Actually, I already pulled it up. I probably have to stop sharing here for a second, and then I'll share it again.
Will you send that to us as well?
Sure, absolutely. Can you see it? Yes? I can't see anybody.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, "Dr. Burke, have you seen this?" In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
You were on mute, Michelle.
Thank you, Megan. I was like, why isn't anybody saying anything? I said comments or thoughts on what Nadine had to say there.
I think it would be interesting to see. I mean, I know ACEs is sort of relatively new, but it would be interesting to see how that affected older generations as well. Like when we had like a lot of fathers going off to war and then coming home, but then also now how maybe that is going to change in the future, like exposure to violence through like media, so social media or the news and things like that, because now it's so much more commonplace for us to have like direct contact with violence through things like YouTube videos. I mean, you can go on YouTube
Right.
and see like total decapitation, assassination videos from all around the world. And it's just become kind of so commonplace. So I wonder how much that's going to start to affect I mean, I'm sure it has already.
Right.
So even if it's not direct in the household.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great point, Emily, because I had kind of questioned, I felt like there was when you look at these 10 questions, I'm like, I think some things are missing. And I think it's like they had to start somewhere, but I wonder too if they'll continue to maybe revise it a bit, if they'll look to add more questions, or if this will be kind of that core. Absolutely. Nadine is actually, was it like a year ago, she became the first Surgeon General of California. And definitely is taking on this issue of toxic stress. So very exciting. You can actually, there's 2 videos. When we became trainers, we have access to 2 different videos. One's called Resiliency. It's about an hour long, and Nadine is part of that, just a portion of that. They also have clips that they show from the 2 doctors that created the ACEs. And so if you're ever interested, you can watch the trailer, but it's something that if a group of you are interested in watching it, I could definitely, we could set something up where you could watch it, and then we can just kind of discuss, they have discussing questions. I kind of thought about showing it today, but decided against it just for the sake of time. And then they have another one called Paper Tigers, which is very, very good. That one's about an hour and a half to hour and 45. They're both kind of documentary style. But both very much worth a watch. So anyways, I have access to those, and we could set up maybe we'll just do that as maybe set up a time to just show it and then have some discussion on that. But any other thoughts or comments about what you heard from Nadine?
What you're seeing is those 2 videos, Resiliency and Paper Tigers, cannot be viewed by the general public. It has to be through, okay.
Right. When I watch her, I don't know how you can't just kind of get like fired up about wanting to make some change within your community, right? And how as prevention we can make some movement on that needle. And it makes me wonder, like, well, why isn't my pediatrician doing the ACEs score with my kids when they come in? Like she said, you would just assume this is something people would want to get on board with. And so and I just look at her as like, gosh, I mean, she is just devoting her life to want to make change for young people. So it's very exciting, I think. Okay, let me.
Michelle?
Yeah.
Also, it seems so, I just feel like it just seems like, I don't know why we haven't developed a program for parents who would like to become parents that would really like to deal with their own ACE scores before moving on into parenthood, being really transparent about
their own, ACEs and how that traumatic stress passes on historically,
Oh, absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
mean,
What a difference that could
maybe
make.
we'll get there, someday where because I don't know if we ever wanted to talk about generational, like how generations of things pass on, diabetes, all these things that cause these problems. We know some of these have genetic components and environmental components. It's just that, wow, what if we could really have a really good conversation about that,
Completely agree. Yeah, what a difference that could make, right? Absolutely. All right. All right, so here's a first look at the what they found back in 1994 when they did this study. So you can see there's 10 categories. They've broken up into kind of like 3 top categories. So household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse. And, obviously you can read through them and see how, 27% of them had substance use, 23% had the parental separation or divorce. That mental illness would be a parent that had mental illness, criminal behavior, just experiencing, you might not even experience the trauma yourself, but experiencing the violence to your mother, maybe from the father, and then emotional, physical neglect, and then the abuse, the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. So oftentimes where there's one, there's 2 or more. Definitely some people just have one, but we definitely see quite a few people have 2 or more. One other comment before I go into this a little bit more, the other thing I was going to say, kind of tying it back to SAPS, when Nadine says, what the hell is in this well? When you have 100 kids that are sick from drinking the water, we can write antibiotic after antibiotic, but it's not going to do anything unless we address the well. It's kind of when Dodie talked about in SAPS, if you remember when we talked about the frog in the pond, we can focus on what the hell is wrong with this frog and try to treat the person, but really we need to go back to figure out what was in that pond. And, so it just goes back to true prevention. Yes, we need to look at the individual, but if we look at not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and look at that and where was the key factors in that caused that. And if we can address that, that's true prevention, right? That's environmental prevention, where if we can address those things, we're going to impact the individual as well. Okay, so everybody should have received Find My ACE score. I don't know if everybody printed it off, but if you would just, again, this isn't to try to stir up a bunch of emotions for anyone. Sometimes it can, but it's more to help us see how common ACEs are. So we can see that from those 17,000, we had some pretty high scores here as far as what people were experiencing. So I want to just give you a couple minutes to fill that out, and then Dodie's going to launch a poll. We can't see who answered it. We just want to get a sense of, from the 20-some people on this call today, where are we at as educated professionals? Where are we at? Where do we fall in as far as our ACE scores go? So again, I'll give you just a couple of minutes to fill that out, and then Dodie will launch that poll, and we'll be able to, and it's just, did you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 plus? I should have done 4 plus because that's how it's laid out, and I didn't, I apologize. But yeah, so just go ahead and fill that out and hit submit, and then we'll take a look at that. Do I have to stop sharing so you can do that?
I don't think so, but I'm gonna quick edit it so that is, so you want it 1, 2, 3, 4 plus?
Yes. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 plus. Do I have 0?
I'm looking, it's slow to pull up here, so just a second here. Oh. You don't have 0. Can you see it, Michelle?
Yes.
Geez, and people are quick. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share the results with you, Michelle.
All right. So we had 24% that had 0 ACEs, 18% with 1, 18% with 2, 18% with 3, and 24% with 4 or more. Any thoughts or comments on that? We're going to compare that to what we see on the next slide. Can I just minimize it and bring it back up again?
Yes.
Maybe? Okay. So what they found in their study was that about 33% had 0. So 1/3 of the people surveyed had 0 ACEs. And what did we have, 24%?
Can you see it?
I can't.
If you
But
can.
that's, no, I meant, but that's okay. What does it say, 24% for 0?
For 0, it was 24%. Yep.
Yeah. 26% had 1 ACE, we had 18%. 16% had 2, we had 18%. 10% had 3, and we had 18%. And then 4 or more, it was at 16%, and we were at
24.
4%. So this is just a simple count. I mean, you know, of how many ACEs a person had. And it measures that biological stress dose that a person may experience. So 16%, or for us, 24%, 1/4 of us on this call today experienced 4 or more ACEs in our life. And when we look at ACE score and health problems, we can look at this dose-response relationship. So we all know the dose response. So the more gas we put in our car, the more miles you can drive, right? And in this situation, any of the graphs I show you today, you're going to see vertically at the bottom the number of ACEs, and then the percentage of whatever it might be. So on this one, it was percentage of health problems. So we can definitely see that dose-response relationship, that correlation between the number of ACEs a person reports having and the percentage of health problems a person might experience. If you have any questions or comments to any of these, please chime in.
Something I like to point out, just because I think it's important, is that while we know, so the correlation between number of ACEs and health problems or mental health problems or any of the other factors that come into play, that ACE doesn't explain everything, which is why you can see that even someone with no ACEs is still going to have the possibility of having issues in their adult life.
Absolutely. Thank you. Is everyone doing okay, or do we need to take a quick 5-minute break? Anybody have any thought on that?
I'm good.
Okay, we'll keep going then. I really didn't think this was going to take us to 11:30, but guess what? It will. It's a good thing you had Dan pick up Crazy Tony. All right. Here's the next one. So another example of, you know, the number of ACEs a person has and the correlation between early smoking initiation, current smoking, and then COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. So about 4% of people with the ACE score of 0 develop COPD, while more than double that percent of people, about 9% with an ACE score of 4 or more. All right, anxiety, depression, difficult concentrating, and smoking. This one, I would actually challenge ACE on this one, and I would really, they need to change the verbiage on what they say about anxiety, depression, and difficulty concentrating in the connection with smoking. And those that you work in the addiction world can speak to this. So, they were saying that, well, first of all, I'll ask you a question. Why would 12-year-olds be more likely to smoke if they have higher ACE scores? What do you think it would feel like to be a 12-year-old with a high ACE score? After filling out that ACE score yourself, what do you think that would feel like to be a 12-year-old with a high ACE score, and why would they be more likely to smoke?
Well, I'm kind of wondering if they had a high ACE score, they would probably feel like they didn't have much control in their life, much that's going on,
Mm-hmm.
And smoking could be a way for them, to feel control, to feel powerful, also maybe to make them feel better.
Yep, exactly, right. All the above. And people who experience these higher ACE scores are more likely, it doesn't mean they will, that's what we know about risk and protective factors and resiliency, but the more ACEs you have, you're more likely to experience anxiety or depression or difficult concentrating. And so their study says it turns out that nicotine, which effectively delivered through inhaling cigarette smoke, can reduce anxiety feelings or depression and improve concentration. I would say what happens is, just like any addiction, nicotine can help nicotine releases those that dopamine, in high levels of dopamine, which in turn then could help them feel less depressed for the time being. But just like with any drug, you use meth or anything else, right? You get that huge surge of dopamine, and our brain starts to not be able to develop that on their own. And so it can kind of trick them into thinking for the time being. Like, same with anxiety. They think that it's reducing that anxiety, but if you do studies on tobacco, nicotine, and smoking, we know it actually makes people more jittery. And so, yes, they might be using it as a self-medication because for the time being, it was meeting the needs. Sometimes you hear kids say that about marijuana. I smoke marijuana because it helps reduce my anxiety or depression. But we know that's not a long-term fix, saying I'm going to use marijuana to battle my depression or anxiety, right? But we can see maybe why kids turn to that, and I always say I've experienced things in my life where I understand why kids maybe turn to substances because they don't have the coping skills. It's readily available. It eases the pain for the moment, right? And so if they don't have other coping skills, they may turn to things like using drugs or smoking for that self-medication. And so this concept of adaptive behaviors, they adapt to these behaviors, even those known as negative consequences in the face of the effects of ACEs, leads us to the idea of trauma-informed care. And it goes back to that question of not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And I think that's such a key question we need to look at, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
This might be something that's been studied, and I'm not sure, and it might just be me totally making something up, but I've always wondered the correlation between people smoking and feeling better and more relaxed and paced breathing due to smoking. That purposeful inhale, exhale, and that consistent paced breathing throughout the process of smoking. I used to have clients, I used to do an inpatient program, and it was right by a Walmart. And I had a guy who at one point was trying to stop smoking, and he said that he would, if he was out and about and would get kind of anxiety, he would go to Walmart and smell the candles and take a deep breath in and then breathe out. And he'd have to like wait to be able to like get his sense of smell back, you know, to like smell another candle. But he would like, and I'm like, well, yeah, you're pace breathing. Like, you know, you're being consistently breathe in, breathe out. And I wonder how much smoking cigarettes or anything has to do kind of with that too of
Sounds like you may need to go and get your PhD, and you have your study.
Yeah.
I just think
Anybody else?
interesting.
No, I think that's right, because they typically, I mean, obviously nicotine's one of the most addictive drugs out there. However, I do think there's that oral fixation, and like you said, that might be what kind of mimics that they think that's why it's calming them, because of that breathing. Anybody on the call, Frank or anybody else, I know there's addiction counselor, anybody else want to speak to that, or any more that you know about that?
Yeah, this is Frank. Not so much that. I think when people are smoking, I think it's the dosing effect, because you're constantly keeping yourself at a regulated amount of nicotine, whereas maybe if you were smoking an illegal substance, it would be maybe less often. So I think if they learn to be able to keep that even keel by being able to dose with nicotine versus other drugs, that would be my comment.
Thanks, Frank. Great points. Absolutely. Yeah, so I see what they were saying there, but I would hate for anybody to tell an audience that smoking can actually really reduce anxiety and feelings of depression and improve concentration. Obviously, we're not going to encourage people to smoke, and it might mimic that, or we may feel, because of that dopamine being released, that it's reducing that depression. And hence, unfortunately, we do see an extremely high rate of people that live with mental illness that smoke. All right, here's another one where we have looking at the relationship with ACE scores and a person who becoming, I don't like to use the word alcohol, becoming addicted to alcohol increases sixfold from an ACE score of 0 to a score of 6. So if you have an ACE score of 6, you can see that you're greatly more at risk of developing alcoholism. And ACEs affect relationships. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry a person with alcohol addiction. And if you think about this, when you look at that, how this tends to transmit from one generation to the next, right? So if you yourself live with addiction, you may end up marrying somebody with addiction, or we know the genetic makeup, how if you have a mom or dad or grandma or grandpa that have an addiction, you're 4 times as likely to develop an addiction yourself. There's definitely a genetic component to that again. I always like to caveat that when I'm working with teens. That doesn't mean you will have an addiction because your mom or dad, grandma or grandpa had addiction. It puts us a little greater at risk, right? And that's same with the ACE scores. Just because I have an ACE score of 5 or more doesn't mean I'm going to develop addiction or marry somebody with addiction, but it puts me greater at risk. ACEs and depression. So depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. And when we do mental health first aid, well, we used to, it's no longer an activity in it, but anyone who's gone through the adult mental health first aid, we did a disability weight chart of how disabling is a physical disability in comparison to a mental disability. And it wasn't to say one was worse than the other, but it was helping people to see that, like, someone who lives with schizophrenia, they may feel their life just as debilitated as someone who's quadriplegic. So somebody who can't feel from the neck down, someone who lives with severe schizophrenia, their life could feel just as disabling as that, which was always just such an eye-opener for me. So you can see here that the risk of depression increases for both men and women in that dose response. So the more ACEs a person has, the likelihood of experiencing depression. And so it increases for both men and women, but we can see women's rates are a little bit higher there.
Something I always wonder about for these is when it's the women versus men is how honest were the men really being when they answered this question?
Yep, absolutely. Great point to
Especially
bring
with
up,
what we
Megan.
know about, suicide rates and men.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that in mental health first aid, and there's no like, this is why, but definitely when we look at teen development, we're like, well, why is the woman's much higher than males? And yeah, a couple things. Men might be experiencing depression at just the same rate, but might not be talking about it just because of what they've, kind of taught to just kind of suppress it. And, men can't feel those feelings. So definitely could be a factor of why we see women just show their emotions more typically. I mean, some men do, but yeah, so definitely it could be higher and men aren't, just are not reporting it for sure. So with this one as well, we can see that generational, intergenerational transmissions, because we do know that if you have depression in your family, that can be passed down as well. Again, just because you have a parent that lives with depression doesn't mean you will, but it puts you greater at risk. You guys don't have this one, but I just felt like in the prevention world, this was worth a look at. And Nadine talked about this, and we've talked about this as far as the correlation of addiction and suicide, but the drastic increase when we see somebody who has 4 or more ACEs, they're almost 20 times the risk of suicide attempts than people who have 0 ACEs. So for me, this is all about prevention. I don't know how we can't look at this and say we need to be addressing this in prevention, because that number to me is staggering if we take a look at that. Any questions or comments about any of those? So these are examples. This is a list of some of the health and social problems documented by the ACE study publication. Because ACEs has a powerful impact on many health and social problems, the ACE researchers concluded that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation. As Nadine said, kind of the leading public health issue that we have in the nation. And this could lead to thinking about prevention. We're living in a time with stunning potential for shifting the trajectory of health and well-being for generations to come. So look at all those examples of ACE attributed problems. Any questions or comments on any of those that you see as you read through those? When you watch the resiliency video, I believe it's that one. I think it's Dr. Fleety that talks about, they were working with people who were living with obesity. And that's when he started to really start looking at these ACE scores and realizing that there was a huge correlation between that and people living with obesity.
Michelle, I think there's poverty is one of them too on a different slide. I've seen in a different presentation. Mm-hmm. You're more likelihood to become in absolute poverty with basic needs not being met.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, there is a slide that talks in a little more depth about that. And I don't have it in this one, but yes, thanks for bringing that up, Dominique. And this one kind of does, knocking down ACE scores will prevent homelessness, unemployment, incarceration, disability learning problems, and poverty. This we already looked at, but they added in here intergenerational transmission. So really, ACEs affect health and social problems throughout the life course, and we need to disrupt that intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. So as we saw, based on the data, but also from those of us who took that poll, again, you guys are thriving well, right? Or you seem to be, and we had pretty high ACE scores when you look at that. And so we see that they're very common. But ACEs have a cumulative impact that is captured by the ACE score. People with high ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase the odds of their children having high ACE scores. This information makes a strong case for concluding that the relationship between the ACE score and health problems is a cause and effect relationship. These next few slides kind of shows an oil spill. So the population attributed risk, you can see the risks that are there. And then that oil spill, this is the percentage of a problem coded by the oil spill represents the percentage of each problem that is potentially prevented by preventing ACEs. So it's believed that if we can prevent ACEs from happening, this is the percentage of a reduction we could see in these areas, which is pretty substantial when you look at this graph. So as you look through this oil spill and how great we could impact these public health issues by reducing ACEs, any thoughts on that?
I just say, because the first time I looked at this, it was kind of confusing for me. So I'm going to real quick explain it, how it made sense to me in case any of you feel the same way. So when you're looking at that oil slick, imagine, so you've got the ACEs in the middle. Now imagine you cleaned up some of that oil slick right out of the middle. What it's going to do is then pull the oil slick in, reducing all areas. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Megan. And here's a couple more. And then even
So what you're saying here is that on this diagram, like the IV drug use, if you could lower the person's ACEs score, the IV drug use would go down by 78%. Is that what that means?
Yes, that is what that means. Yep. So any thoughts or comments to that?
Could you go to the last slide real quick, just for a second?
This one? This one, is that right?
I'd like to say, Belinda, it wouldn't necessarily go down by 78%. That 78% is what it is affecting right now, but that 78% would decrease. Does that make sense?
Okay, so a person's ACEs score, for whatever reason, makes them more susceptible to be an IV drug user by 78%. If you can reduce the ACEs score, that 78% will go down.
Right.
Correct.
So the insurmountable task is helping, an entire country, an entire world, reduce their ACEs score.
Yes.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, but you can start in your community. That's one of the things about this. And we'll get to that at the end, I think.
Yes.
Oh, there's hope at the end. Right now, I just want to go eat a chocolate bar or something.
There's hope at the end.
Okay. Am I muted? I gotta make sure I'm not muted. No, okay. So I don't think you have this one either, but common cause, everyone can contribute to prevent accumulation of ACEs. So here you go, Belinda. Our culture has built separate systems and ways of thinking about health and social problems. This way of doing business in society is sometimes called a siloed approach. Have you experienced that? I know we all have. Each silo has its own budget, training, and mental model about preventing and treating individual types of problems. We might all be kind of trying to chip away at this, but we kind of have that tendency to work in silos. The ACE study and related neuroscience findings shows us that viewing health and social problems as separate issues is an illusion based upon outdated mental models. Now that we know that many health and social problems have a common cause, the powerful impact of ACEs throughout the life course. So we used to talk about breaking down the silos, but that's not particularly because human nature and organizational behavior keep siloed systems well defended. The good news is that none of us have to stop working on the issues we're passionate about. If we simply add a thread to our work that is focused on preventing accumulative ACEs, the common thread will connect and align all our work in powerful ways. So we all have a piece in impacting the ACE score, and if we can just, weave a thread of that. And here's the thing, Belinda, the kids that you work with in schools, you maybe couldn't have prevented the 4 ACEs they already have, but you can preventing them to getting to 10 ACEs, right? So knowledge is power. We can teach them self-regulation skills, healthy coping skills, ways to manage those things in their life, building healthy relationships, building connections to their community. So we might not be able to prevent everybody to, get everybody to a score of 0. We probably will never see that, right? Because we all have, we're all human. We all make mistakes, and we're flawed. But we can definitely help to try to lower those, or help kids not to increase those numbers. If that makes sense. So we have the power to shift the dynamics that lead to high ACE scores. Through our collective knowledge and action, we're the ones with the power to shift the dynamics within our families, communities, and societies that lead to that ACE score. So this is kind of our roadmap. The ACEs study is kind of our roadmap to get there.
Can you go back to that one really quick?
Yep.
So if you guys look at it, there's another slide that is those cogs right there, working together. And each cog is an agency or a person in a community that is working with other people to help spread the knowledge about ACEs and to work together as a team to reduce ACEs in individuals' lives.
Thanks, Megan. Would someone be willing to read this slide for us?
Nurturing the healthy development of these protective systems affords the most important preparation or inoculation for overcoming potential threats and adversities in human development. Similarly, damage or destruction of these systems has dire consequences for the positive adaptive capacity of individuals.
Thank you. And you can see it says core protective systems. So we're going to that, the word resiliency, right? That ability to bounce back despite all the things challenges we maybe have experienced in our life. So what do we know about individuals who do well despite adversity? What are some protective factors that we know that help people become resilient despite the adversity they've experienced?
They have a support team that is very caring and understanding and forgiving and is not judgmental.
Mm-hmm. That's a big one. Yeah, so you can see that just right on there, we've got it broken into 3. The capabilities, so personal attributes like positive view of one's life, self-efficiency and self-regulation, attachment and belonging, as Dominique talked about, and then that attachment to community or culture or spirituality. So the first one there, that individual capabilities, you guys don't have this slide either, but positive view lets me know I'm important and valuable. So it's important for us to know that, for all of us to know that we're valued, and that we can contribute something to the world. And this gives us hope. And if you guys remember, I don't know if you've ever gone through mental health first aid, youth mental health first aid, assist, so much of what a person who is really struggling needs is hope. Hope that recovery is possible. Hope that you can get through this. It's maybe not going to go away. You may have to live with this, if you have addiction, you're going to live with that addiction for the rest of your life, but there's hope that this recovery is possible, that you can live in recovery. Same with mental health. Sometimes you'll be in full remission, and sometimes you're going to have to, you will live with bipolar for the rest of your life, but you can live with it in recovery. So giving that hope, good things can happen to me, so we can build these things in kids. We can give them that positive self-worth to see that you are important. You can give back to your community. And so we can be a big piece to this as far as creating that protective factor in the young people that we're working with. When we notice the core gifts of each person and help them find their opportunities to give those gifts to a community they care about, we're helping to generate positive view of hope. You know, they need self-efficiency is the belief that, self-efficacy is the belief that I do influence what happens to me. They need to have self-regulation. And again, we can help them learn how to self-regulate, use those self-regulation skills by teaching them, you know, breathing, deep breathing, mindfulness, you know, maybe prayer, calming practices. So these are things that we can impact in our field. The next one is attachment and belonging. That, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to point out for that individual capabilities one is the circular logic. Is that when we're working with someone or talking with someone, and by trying to push them to just be better, to just try harder, when their biological adaptations didn't give them those tools to be able to do the tasks that you're wanting to do, it keeps them from being able to do those things.
Right.
You're going to end up doing more harm than good. Because when you try to push someone to do something that they simply can't do, it can backfire and make them end up feeling like a failure, like they can't do anything. And so that's something I think is important to consider.
If you would just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you would just go do this, if you would just,
you should be able to do it.
Right. Absolutely. All right, so the second protective system we can nurture is belonging. So relationship with caring and competent people are vital contributors to resiliency and recovery. And I've always talked about how, you know, in the resiliency studies, with Hawkins and Catalano, they talk a lot about having that one person that loves you ridiculously, or just that loves you despite all of your life's decisions. But they kind of take it a step further here, that sometimes this message gets shortened and only includes caring relationships, but competency requires learning new skills and practicing safety in all its forms when relating to people who are hardwired for survival in a dangerous or unpredictable world. So remember, their brain is kind of rewired to survive in that dangerous and unpredictable world. So they need caring relationships, but they need those caring relationships also help them acquire new skills and practice, you know, safety in all forms when relating to people. So it's important that they have both of that, right? The caring relationships, but that caring relationships are also helping them learn those new skills. And this last one would be the community, faith, and cultural process. We foster thriving communities. So fostering thriving communities is about empowerment. It's about investing in the people who have the most at stake so they can be the expert leaders of their own community change. I love this picture. I mean, this is the slide they give, but, you know, I often think of the Native American community in our state, and just so many neat things that they have, protective factors that they have built into their culture. And I know, I'm not sure who's all on this call today, but I know like Diane Toller, and I know Frank has worked very closely with the Native American population. And, you know, I think it just speaks to things that are doing like Marla Bobear about really tying in the cultural aspect to prevention and how that can be such a protective factor. So I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to that.
No, I would agree. I know they've done research, and especially the Native American population, if they're practicing their spirituality, the alcohol and drug rates are definitely decreased.
Absolutely. Yep. Thanks, Frank. So yeah, building community capacity. And you know what I thought about when I thought community capacity, this is so much about what we talked about with SAPS, right? The SPIF process and building that capacity within a community. And it's about helping people learn, manage, and improve their efforts systematically, and about providing flexible funding state-of-the-art education and direct supports that help mobilize everyone who wants to help. So I think this is a great way to implement the SPIF, of looking at your own community to look at, assess what's going on with your community in regards to ACEs, and, building that capacity to address it, like Nadine was talking about. I thought everybody would have, their clients come in and fill out this ACE score, and then they would kind of have this triage approach of helping this young person. And what a better way to do that than kind of going through that SPIF process. So to learn more about capacity building processes, we look to communities that have changed the way people work together to solve tough problems and have stunning success. Well, I have just a couple examples I'll show with that. So each successful community has traveled that journey differently because each community is unique. But communities that have reduced major social problems reduce the percentage of young people with high ACE scores, and improve key factors for resiliency do use similar process for achieving better results. So Belinda, I can understand how you feel kind of defeated at looking at some of these slides, and I think a lot of people do, but I do think there's a lot of hope that communities are making change and that we can move the needle just a little bit. And again, maybe it's not getting everybody ACEs score to 0, but helping them from, if they have 2, not going to 4, or 4 to 7, whatever it might be, and helping them to become resilient despite the ACE score they may have. So here's some examples. In Washington State, a system of community public health and safety networks call these communities high capacity communities. The process they've used since 1994 is called General Community Capacity Development. It's a public health approach to solving integrated problems by improving people's connections, their shared responsibility, and the collective impact of their efforts. They put this in place, a 4-phased initiative process to nurture development of healthy and productive adults regardless of their circumstances into which they are born. And that kind of goes back to what Dominique was saying, is we really do need to look at the ACE scores for the adults we're working with. Not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and then help them see how that could be passed down to their children and what they could be doing to protect their children. It's an important approach that invites all members of the community to shift the ways we engage with one another on a day-to-day basis, improving people's connections, shared responsibilities, skills, and efficiencies. So the 4 phases of the process are leading expansion, coming together around issues of importance in the community, learning together, and results-based decision-making. Again, I can't say enough how better way to do that than to go through a SPIF process with a group of people, a coalition within your community that wants to move the needle on this and make change. These are just a couple examples. I'm not going to spend I didn't give you these slides. Again, I will. But I just wanted you to see this website, and I'll share with you of just for the sake of time, I won't go into it too detail, but this one comes from Walla Walla, Washington. I just wanted to say that because it sounded fun. The community decided that neighboring is a verb and commenced a neighboring revolution. During each ACE informed process, inviting new members and introducing different sectors of the community to each other has been critical. With the new awareness from the ACE scores, something happened. She spoke up about the hardship in her life. So a gal within the community talked about how she had an ACE score of 10. And she was just kind of going through life, going through the motions until she discovered her ACE score. And she's now really became an advocate to the message and talking to people in the community and saying how it's, you've probably heard it takes a village to raise a child. And so that's been a huge game changer for them. Same with this one. This is a public health process. And again, I will just share these slides so you can go ahead and look these up as some examples of what things that you can be doing within your community to help to address ACEs. This slide I think is pretty interesting. It really talks about the our justice system, right? So if kids don't feel safe at home and they don't feel safe at school, they kind of come knocking on the door of the criminal justice system. And So it talks about why are we surprised when they don't feel safe at home, they don't feel safe at school when they knock at the door of the court. But that picture, school personnel and neighborhood residents understood their juvenile crime prevention rules differently. The adults now hold themselves accountable to intentionally and systematically generate safe and welcoming social and academical environments that don't exclude children who have experienced trauma. This approach led to changes in this county juvenile justice system, and it reduced the recidivism among youth served by the court. So you see there, among youth with high ACE scores, 85% were first suspended from school in the 2nd grade. So it's really taking that approach that not one size fits all for every child that we're working with, that you really need to kind of, again, what happened to you, that's what's wrong with you when these kids come in. And I mean, if any one of us did not feel safe at home and school, that's going to impact us. That's that, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we don't feel safe, if we don't have those basic needs met, we can't really focus on the other things we need to, like schoolwork and such, and it kind of snowballs. And so just by the schools recognizing, knowing they have to take a different approach in working with kids, they really saw those rates go down. So supporting healthy communities process that respect cultural tradition and values is a high leverage activity. Just as riding a tide lifts all boats, a high capacity community lifts all beings. People living in high capacity communities are less likely to have adverse childhood experience scores, high adverse childhood experience scores, less drug and alcohol abuse, less depression, and less, severe and persistent mental illness. And they have fewer problems in school and work. So change is up to us. I just can't say enough that I just think that this is, that's why I love risk and protective factors and looking at adverse childhood experiences, because that's really what, no matter what we're trying to prevent, mental illness, suicide, addiction, if we can reduce those risk factors and increase those protective factors in the people that we're working with, we're going to see a reduction in all these things that we're trying to prevent. And so I think, it's just starts by us talking about it, being willing to talk about it, bring knowledge to people about this. It says that people create a new reality long before new laws are passed. Yes, we need laws passed, but communities coming together to make change, we can make a difference and move the needle on this, and we can see a reduction in these ACE scores, or we can help prevent from kids getting more ACE scores and increasing those protective factors, whether you look at the risk protective factors or the 40 developmental assets, whatever it might be. One thing I wanted to tell you was there is a, it's called ACEs Connection Network, or ACEs Connection Roundup. So if you go to ACEs Connection Network, you can sign up to receive their emails. And I get a daily, I don't know if you get that, Megan, the ACEs Connection Roundup. It's really good. I can't say I spend because they send several articles every day. It's just in one email. But some really good stuff. I kind of always just kind of skim through it every day to see if there's an article that I want to read. But if you're more interested in learning more about ACEs or kind of staying up to speed on what they're doing, that would be a great resource to go to.
Also, I believe there are talks in the works of doing more ACE interface presenter trainings. So if you're interested in being able to present this information with the slides and like Michelle is doing today, I think there will be more opportunities for that training in the future. So you could let myself or Michelle know about that, and we can pass it on to the people in charge.
Yes, absolutely. Questions, comments, thoughts?
One resource that I have found, if you're on Facebook, there's a group called Trauma Informed Educators Network. And so it's kind of a place where they can have discussions about things or share resources and things like that. So that's one, as a piece of this, I think that would be helpful.
Awesome. Anything else? Thanks, Dodie. All right. Let's see. Is there a question or just a comment?
Just
Thank
comment.
you. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Taylor.
So
Dodie?
just one thing, I misspoke at the beginning with in regards to the ethics. It is the dates are actually the 21st, 24th, and 28th. I have it written down wrong in my calendar, so I will change it in my calendar. So with that, we'll see some of you next week. Let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Frank.